So allow me to introduce our moderator for the panel. Rashmi Ketta is a product manager in corporate strategy at Verizon, where she is building roadmaps for two products valued to grow yearly business revenue by $800 million by 2025. She was a data scientist prior to being in product and also had a startup of her own. She's also the first woman of color and South Asian woman global lead of her women's employee resource group at Verizon in its history of 30 plus years. Some additional things I'd like to also add. She's also a Harvard Business Review advisor, been a Toastmaster since 2018, mentored over 55 students, and a lot more. There's a lot more to read about her. So Rashmi, if you could come on down.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? I hear myself, so we're good. So I have a wonderful panel and two other great panelists with me today, and it is my honor to be moderating this panel and to ask them questions. So they'll do most of the talking. So with me today, I have Matt Gray and Carrie Tian. Just going to read a little bit about them. So Matt is a VP and head of product at Match or Match Group. Prior to Match, he drove the vision and strategy for A/B testing, feature flagging, and other experimentation at Meta, touching over 2.8 billion active users and over 100,000 experiments each year. So Matt also led product at Zipcar and a few other B2B startups. So welcome, Matt. And Carrie is currently a senior product manager at MailChimp, where she's led growth and product for email marketing, the company's flagship product. She's also led product marketing at her previous companies like Medium and Alto Pharmacy. So thank you for joining me, and welcome to both of you. How are both of you?
Doing all right. Can everyone hear us?
Testing, testing.
All right, so our topic today is creating a growth engine, and actually where does growth sit in the product landscape. So throughout the years, we've heard so many different terms like growth marketing, growth hacking, growth engineering, and then actually building growth teams. So I wanted to throw the question to both of you. What does growth actually mean to both of you?
Want to start?
You wanna?
Well, I mean, one of the things I think that comes to mind when a lot of people imagine growth is like these kind of cheap growth tactics. Like growth hacking is almost like a pejorative term at this point of a team who will come in or a person who will come in, like essentially mess with your product, almost turn it over and flip it on its head. In order to like move a metric temporarily, and then they'll like leave, and they've like left a bunch of tech debt and a mess in there behind them. And so I think it has a pejorative connotation. But I think what the most effective organizations are doing is trying to find sustainable ways to both grow the product. So it's not just like a step function; it's a continuous increase in growth, and it's a sustainable relationship that growth team has with the products and features that it works on.
Cool. I totally agree with that, down to growth hackers giving the entire discipline kind of a bad rap of not being really thoughtful and just trying to rush and get quick wins. I think something that really sets apart growth is you're not judged necessarily on the quality of how cool your product is or how innovative it is, but you're really trying to figure out insights, and that speed of learning is actually what you're optimizing for, and you ship a lot of experiments or whatever in order to try to figure out good surface areas that you can then iterate on, and that makes sense for the company to spend a lot more time investing in. So I've seen great growth teams sit in product or marketing or as an independent department, and I think that's super down to the company's individual DNA. But I think that's what really unites great growth teams, is that emphasis on learning and insights rather than just what are we shipping, how cool is it?
Yeah, so go ahead.
No, just to say that I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've both of you mentioned that growth could be like an innate part of the company as a product itself, but then it could also be like a separate team on its own, just depending on the size or structure. So what is a good starting point if a company hasn't invested anything or have anything related to growth just yet?
I might start with this. I'd say one thing I've seen really work for companies is it can be daunting to go from nothing to like a fully fledged growth discipline. So something cool is if you have some major project or there's a lot of buy-in around the company that X part of the product really needs work, and then you can form kind of a tiger team to get started there. And what's cool about being on one of those teams is that they have the dual purpose of trying to actually improve the outcomes and finish that particular project, but they're also trying to figure out what is the organization's tolerance for different types of methodologies and what's a cadence that works. So I've seen teams, for instance, a common problem is going from the marketing website into the product itself, and people often feel a lot of confusion and, hey, what I saw advertised on the site itself isn't matching what I'm seeing once I hit the product. Like bridging that gap can be a pretty tightly defined mission, and then from there it can blossom out.
Yeah, and another thing to just piggyback on that, like going from 0 to 1 with like no growth function, what you mentioned around alignment is really key. Like I think it's important that the leadership of the organization, leadership of whatever group you're in, they and you have the same understanding of what drives growth in the organization, and not only what drives growth, but that's important to drive growth in the way that it needs to be driven. Because if you don't have that basic understanding, you're just going to be constantly butting heads. Yeah. So it really starts by just creating alignment in the beginning around those factors, and then from there, it's about then you can open up like the conversation to expanding around like, okay, like we have typically not had marketing and product work together as closely, so maybe they should be working together. Oh wait, like you can't just have them working part-time. They have to kind of be full-time on this, yeah. Right? And so then you have to start normalizing all the things that will make the team successful. But at least in my experience, it all starts with like agreeing on the fact that you need to, like what drives growth and the fact that we need to grow in that way.
So do you have like any framework or just like metrics or starting metrics that would help guide, like what is that North Star other than what we talked about yesterday, like that mission, vision, and then dropping down to goals? Like what are some specific examples that either of you might have with that?
Frameworks for driving growth? Mm-hmm. Well, so I mean, I think when you're starting from nothing, you have to kind of like think about, what are the things, where does our business exist in the market, where does it add value? And then you can often from there identify what are the things that our product does that when it increases, it adds value. So for instance, like at Meta, a big metric was always DAU, right? They're trying to drive like the number of active users creates more social engagement, which creates value, which then creates more people who create ad revenue, like ad impressions that create business value. Yeah. But that's not true for every business. At Zipcar, for instance, when I was there, growth was very focused on driving reservations, and repeat and retention was really key. So it's different for every business. I don't know, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think a really good exercise to do is with all of the company leaders, like at the company leadership level, trying to map out, like literally on a Post-it note, how do we think this business grows? Which sounds insanely stupid or basic, but you'd be surprised. I'm thinking back to both Medium and Alto. At Medium, for instance, there was a lot of debate over, at various points in our company, are we expecting that the more readers there are, then the more incentive there will be for writers to come and write here as opposed to anywhere else? Or maybe it's simply you get the best writers in the world and then the readership problem will solve itself. And it's not necessarily that there's one right answer, but it is if your head of marketing hugely disagrees with your head of product and they disagree with the CEO on what's the most important thing, then your growth team is really kind of hamstrung and unable to figure out what that basic unit is. I really liked Matt's example of you kind of want to reduce down to what drives value for the company, because otherwise you can really get stuck optimizing for things that, like great, our top line number of users is going up potentially, but then it's not actually translating into business impact.
Yeah.
So anytime you're able to concretely say like, hey, as long as we get X incremental reservations or bookings or new users, like that is definitely going to translate into value for the business. That is likely a great kind of foundation to start building a growth team around.
I love how you mentioned like about the post-its. It's so fundamental and seems very rudimentary, but I feel like sometimes we all just need to get in a room, like put up a bunch of post-its like on the wall behind us. And one of the tools that my team started using is called Miro board, and like it's amazing. Just you can use like our virtual post-its, different sizes, and then you can kind of group together different colors. So it's been really nice, like ever since we've started implementing that. I'm actually going to jump into this question because it relates a little bit to our topic of defining growth and then in product versus marketing. And I know we touched upon it a little bit, so do you want to expand on your approach to both product-led growth versus marketing?
Yeah, I mean, in some way that like those distinctions are just like internal branding. However, like when I think of product-led growth and like what that actually means, you're using the product itself and the behaviors within it to cause everything to grow. So a business that is growing through the product is not one that is growing as prominently, or there's an intentional focus on growing through the product rather than growing through like pure acquisition efforts. So a classic example here is like Pinterest. Like Pinterest could have spent like billions of dollars advertising at people in, but the single most valuable thing that they ever did to grow was opening up their user-generated content, making it available and indexed by search engines, so then people could search for those things, find it, enter Pinterest. Wow, Pinterest is cool. Let me create my own account. Then they start posting, which then is indexed by search engines, creates a growth loop.
That's true.
And so that's when I think of product-led growth. It's kind of that mindset and that kind of thinking. Whereas like when I think about marketing, it's more in the space of like positioning and competition and where you are in the market, and therefore here's who we need to acquire and how. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can't tell if I'm a great person or a horrible person to answer this, in that I started out as a marketer, and the reason I'm doing product growth right now is whenever I had a marketing project, I would, for instance, launching a new feature, I'd go into the product, give it a try, and then notice, hey, this is really hard to use, or we're totally missing a password reset flow. How are people going to be able to log in? And then I would ask for permission to quickly fix those like fundamental pathways. So I was kind of running back and forth between the growth worlds and the marketing worlds, and I love both of them a lot. I'd say I agree with what Matt just laid out, and something I also think about is ideally with product-led growth, it has enough momentum and there's enough like word of mouth or referrals that it kind of just keeps itself going. I think marketing is really critical to get to a state where that's possible in the first place, like where you have a really healthy ecosystem. And I also expect marketing to be really critical for when you're dramatically repositioning your product or launching something really new. Like product-led growth is a great flywheel, but you need that initial energy or momentum. And that's kind of when I think about whether I'm leaning more heavily on marketing or whether I'm leaning more heavily within in-product dynamics.
Okay, got it. And then, so I think both of you touched upon the concept of the growth loop. I know you used the term and you kind of just explained the concept of it. So do you have any like examples from your own experiences of how you found like, oh, this is the aha moment, like this is a growth loop and now I can like grow and just keep kind of building upon it? So are there any concrete examples in that way?
I have a basic one, but I'll go for it, which is I'm currently at MailChimp on our email marketing product. And we send out billions of emails a day. You probably have some unread ones in your inbox right now from MailChimp. And at least for our free tier, there's always a logo in the bottom of the email that says sent using MailChimp. And so if I illustrate this growth loop, it's someone sends an email using MailChimp, someone receives it and thinks, hey, I need to do email marketing as well, and then they sign up for an account, they then go send an email, and that loop repeats itself. It's definitely not, it's not a huge coefficient by any means. Tons of people are receiving emails and will never need to run email marketing at their company. But that's one example of any surface areas you have where especially recipients or people who see them could also be great viewers of your product or great users of your product, that'll be a great surface area. I know, for instance, Eventbrite really shifted to really prominently make you aware that the event you're RSVPing to is on Eventbrite, and they're doing lots of pushing to try to get you to set up your own event.
Yeah. Do you have any examples?
Yeah, I mean, this is not one from my direct personal everyday life, but a lot of folks know at Meta there is a big focus on Oculus, for instance, and so when you're growing an ecosystem like that from scratch, so where do you start? And so I mean, the kind of core loop there is we need to build an ecosystem that has at least enough experiences that people will find it worth it to buy the headset, and then once you have enough people with the headsets, then that attracts developers, and then the developers will make better apps, which then make it even more appealing for people to come in. And now that you have that ecosystem, you can start to feed monetization. And now you have a big enough ecosystem where, because you can charge users money, it attracts even more developers because they're like, oh, I can make a lot of money here. And then it just starts spinning faster and faster. And so there's examples like that all over the place. And that's a slower moving one. I mean, even in dating products, there's I work at Match every day on dating. And so you have these little engagement loops you can also create with things like, okay, you send some likes or you rate profiles, that then results in matches. Then you get a push notification, brings you back into the app. The push notification, now that you're in the app, you're sending messages, which then create notifications for other people. Then enough of that is happening where you're eventually leading some people to success who then tell other people about it, or they get enough of a whiff of this could be good for me that they tell other people about it, or post a positive review in the App Store.
Yeah.
For some people, there's all these kind of concentric circles of loops that go bigger and smaller.
That's awesome. And I was like, you can probably add on to that list of relationship advice that we had yesterday. Product-related relationship advice. Okay, I'll fill in that question, but I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit into maybe tackling with change. And there's some things that in your growth cycle that you can control. And you can study the market, you can kind of acquire the data, but there's some things that you just cannot control, like where the market is going or if there's an unexpected churn. So do you have any stories or examples from if you were trying to go towards a certain metric, if that didn't work out and you found something else in that hunt?
Yeah, sure. So one example I have is from my work at MailChimp. So I think an illusion in product is that one day you will have built all the right things and everything will just work itself out and then you will be done. And so far I have discovered that that is super unlikely to happen, in part because you can get stuff, you can get a bunch of the core flows really heavily optimized, but then like you're mentioning, things are changing in the world all around us with competitors and then also within the company itself. So at MailChimp, I started out owning activation, meaning how many of our users are getting value from the product super early on. So we spent a long time defining this and trying, like we mentioned earlier, you really want a proxy for what's value for the company, as opposed to we could make people sign up for a bunch of different things, we could make them add on a bunch of integrations, but what do they need to do so that they actually understand how MailChimp can help them and feel that aha moment and end up being a lot stickier as users. So initially, we defined this as users sending an email within their first 7 days. And I can talk a bit more about defining each of those, but we waffled a lot over 48 hours or 7 days or 30 days, for instance. And then that was going pretty well. But in the background, as we were trying to optimize this metric, MailChimp was making the shift from a single product, which is email marketing, to an all-in-one marketing platform. And that, broadly speaking, is what's happening in MarTech these days. Like, everyone wants to be that all-in-one platform. That's the hub of a business's marketing. Anyway, so that was a lot of debate within the company of at what point do we shift from optimizing for that first-time email experience and start layering in all of the other marketing channels that we were introducing, such as landing pages, websites, social posts, ads. And I think the line we ended up drawing was when those businesses were good enough on their own, that's when it was worth the risk of introducing them early on in the MailChimp experience and potentially cannibalizing some email users. So kind of the very basic sniff test was if we could conceivably see someone signing up for this platform and only using our landing pages and never thinking about email and still being quite happy with their experience, that was the time when we started saying, instead of just being incentivized to drive first-time email sends, we then layered on, for instance, landing page publishes.
I love that. Yeah.
I mean, the shift that came to mind was far simpler. That's a lot. It sounds like a lot of deep conversations that happen over a long period of time.
Yeah.
In my case, it was as a fairly new leader at Match, which is quite an old dating product. It's the oldest one, actually. There's we're kind of moving away from this legacy of being very email oriented and obviously being a mobile first business now. There was a lot of focus in the very beginning on when I first started on driving ecosystem activity through conversations. And so the thinking there was it was that small loop I mentioned. A conversation leads to an email or a push, which then brings you back in, which then has you sending more messages, more likes, which create more ecosystem activity. And that while that is an important loop, it wasn't and while receiving a message is a moment of delight in the experience, it's not enough to actually sustainably cause rapid growth. And so when I kind of inherited a team and they were focused on that initially, and so a lot of this is actually in the past couple of months is just re-goaling them off of DAO, because by growing daily active users, it causes it first of all creates an incentive to think about both acquisition and retention, bringing in where do users come from. Well, if we're going to be Misi about it, there's new users and retained users, and so then where's the biggest opportunity, and then that also brings marketing and product together, and it creates a more deliberate growth motivation for the pod, and so that was a kind of a shift in mindset. That was after kind of realizing that this loop wasn't, even though it was working for some things and it was driving healthy ecosystem activity, that ecosystem activity wasn't yet yielding the organic acquisition you'd hope to see from that, outside the product.
You just had to connect it to the bigger.
Right, and so it wasn't and so now because we've re-goaled, there's more promising things that are being considered around SEO and more effectively removing bottlenecks in our onboarding experience and more effectively using the referral networks at the top of the funnel, also things like landing page optimization, things like that. So just kind of, yeah.
I'm curious about what that was like. How did you make that decision for that shift? Was it that you saw growth in conversations and then it wasn't translating to top line revenue?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Okay. I was seeing, it wasn't just it wasn't that it was translating to top line revenue, it was not translating into the ecosystem growing. And what actually creates value in a dating product or any social product is the network you can interact with itself. So we call it liquidity. The liquidity of the product is where the value is coming from. And so that once that kind of realization dawned on us, that's where we needed to just grow, focus on growing the liquidity, i.e. DAO.
Was that over quarters or years?
No, that was months.
Okay.
It was there's like a very strong sense of urgency around this, right? Like this is an existential necessity for the business. So we made it a big priority.
Got it. I was curious because it's always like, hey, is this not translating yet because we haven't hit on quite the right tactics or experiments?
Yeah.
Or is it just, hey, what we fundamentally thought was most important to the business like actually isn't, and there's a better proxy for what we should drive? So thanks for that.
Yeah, that's what it was, yeah.
And I love that because there's always that connection between how any field has its own like two buckets of like being an art and a science, and same thing like in products, same thing in growth. So, and I have a question like related to that, where you see growth as a science is more of the metrics, and one of the questions touched upon it, like relying on growth just like through click ads or other types of data-backed metrics, and then there's art of growth where you're trying to have a whole like cultural mind shift change or culture change. So how do you balance between the two? There has to be a balance. So what is the right one in your opinion?
Sure, I can say that I think something super valuable for growth teams is, I kind of think of it as the art part of it is what you're doing and why, and then the science part of it is, okay, like now what's the most efficient way of actually making it happen, and how do we know if it'll work or not? And one common trap I see growth teams fall into is they just will copy tactics that famously worked for some huge company, and they're like, here's a laundry list of most other companies have onboarding checklists for new users. Let's go ahead and just ship one. At MailChimp, and I think this is pretty common for all product experiments, we have the hypothesis where we say, like, by making X change in the product, X metric will change because, and then the user behavior or psychology behind that change. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of airtime is spent with those first two things, which is what change are we making, and how much of an impact are we expecting to see or did we see. And I think companies tend to dramatically under-prioritize talking about the user psychology reasons behind it. And if you have a really compelling insight of here's what users need or are missing, that often drives a lot better ideas and helps with prioritization, rather than if you just focus on let's change something and see what happens. I also think it can help you disprove like bigger swaths of an experiment backlog if you have a really sound like reason user psychology. And you're seeing a couple experiments in a row not pan out, you can rest assured that it's not just that your tactics are too small or too big or whatever, and you can say, hey, actually, I think we're wrong about what our users need in this moment. Let's go down a different path.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also like that question about click ads that kind of goes in two directions. One is like relying just on data. And so like on that, and then the other kind of direction it goes is like what's the role of like ads when it comes to growth? So like on the second part of that, like I think you touched on it in your earlier remarks, which is that like you need to get this loop started somehow. And you also, especially as you're trying to work out, like maybe this, it's working out, like the loop spins like this, then it slows down a little bit, and then you need to feed it in. But then eventually you figure out how to get it spinning really fast, and then you don't need to rely as much on feeding paid users in, and it's because it's feeding organic users in itself. So like that covers that part of it. But then the other part is around like purely quantitative measures. And I was kind of thinking that, where'd the question go? Dang. Relying on ad. Geez, I just lost my train of thought. Shoot.
All good. I will just say relying purely on ads gives me hives a little bit, just in how competitive those marketplaces are. That was when I was staffed in marketing teams. It's like you find something that really works for your company and it's performing really well in campaigns, and then a couple months later suddenly everyone is doing it and it's become totally commoditized, and then you have to, like, it's such kind of, I don't want to say a zero-sum game, but I think that's what's stressful about relying specifically on ads, as opposed to if you get something working great within your product, then you can keep reaping the benefits regardless of whether X other company or competitor is doing the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, who was it, Reforge talking about like the decay in channel performance.
Yeah.
So you're always chasing the new channels to have them decay. And while that is helpful, it's not sustainable. But the thing with relying on kind of quantitative insights, that's the point I was trying to make. Our previous speaker, is your name Lauren? Thank you, Lauren, for your presentation, by the way. Yeah, Lauren was talking about the importance of like empathy as the backbone of product leadership. And to what Carrie was saying, it's really important to understand what the users' motivations are, what their emotional and social context is in a given situation. And by deeply understanding that, it helps you not only come up with better experiment ideas, better hypotheses. It helps you to better understand why you might have seen the metric change as a result of an experiment. Like maybe this one went up a little bit, but this one went way down. And like, why did that happen? Yeah. And so I think that it's incredibly important to inform growth work with qualitative insights from user research, direct user interaction, as much as possible, because it's such a great informer of the experiments you run.
Of course, and thank you for explaining both of them. And I think another theme that maybe like we can probably just talk for the rest of the time is about how maybe convincing like leadership, or who are your stakeholders about what this growth is. And then a follow-up to that could be who actually owns growth, or doesn't everyone part of any team has to have some sort of like a growth mindset? And that theme kind of goes into that first question. If there's a conflict, or if someone's not thinking in the same lines as yours, so how do you empower your teams to kind of push back when growth data is in conflict, or you have conflicting ideas in the room? So what are your experiences with that?
I just got a little bit of PTSD reading this question. It's a really good one. I guess a couple thoughts. We already touched on how important it is trying to get as aligned as possible with company leadership on what is important for, like, what's the fundamental growth loop for our business. That is quite helpful if you're able to make it happen. I would say pretty good advice I got when I started out being a growth PM is your metrics are your baby and or your product, in the same way that other teams will be showing like a lot more impressive products normally, and they'll be like, look what we shipped, and it got upvoted on Product Hunt, or people are sharing like fancy screenshots of it. Often like growth product work is deeply unsexy, but it drives a lot of metrics, and it's like as much as possible, like I think it's pretty self-evident for anyone on a growth team why the metric matters and how good it is for the business if it improves. But for the rest of the company, which is maybe used to judging things based on how cool or impressive the features are, like that's a huge mindset shift. And like really hyping up every time you either are able to improve that metric, or you've learned something new about how your product works or how your users work. That's helpful on kind of the like micro day-to-day basis. Do you have thoughts on like so that's kind of like best practices for on a day-to-day, like how do you shield and help your growth team do its best work? But then this question's asking about what happens when there's kind of maybe open conflict and the growth team feels a lot of conviction about something, but maybe other teams or company leaders disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I found it really important to have really, like, we talked earlier about like the importance of aligning on how you grow and the importance of growth. I think that those types of principles can then be codified into product principles or company principles or values, or something where they're enshrined and then can be referenced and be like, okay, well, we're in this situation. Should we do the thing that our principles say, or should we do the thing that looks like easy in the short term? Of course, you do the thing your principles say, as difficult as that is, and you find a way to make it work in the short term. And so I think that having those being extremely principled is very important in growth because there's going to always be this tendency towards potentially towards short-term optimization. And so the principles that hold you and anchor you on like the future of like how you're creating value and create guardrails around like what we will and will not allow, kind of like leveling up your culture so that you won't just tolerate short-term thinking.
Yeah.
It forces everyone to think a little bit bigger, a little further out. And so that's I think one thing that can be really helpful. If you don't have really strong principles, work internally on aligning on those so that you can that helps to deal with a large portion of the conflict that growth teams can sometimes create.
I will say also, this is way less idealistic, but sometimes I've seen, for instance, if a growth team and another team hugely disagree on what, say, the top priority is, and they're looking at conflicting data, or one team, maybe the growth team has data and maybe the other team doesn't, you can expend a lot of political energy and goodwill fighting over the top thing. But then if things 2 through 5, like teams actually do agree on, maybe you just quietly go work on those. That is super different from what you just advocated of like stick to your guns, and that's the only way to build, or like that's the best way to build a healthy growth practice. But I just wanted to call that out in case it feels like it maybe like having agreed upon growth principles for your company is a long way coming, for instance.
I think it could be a mix of both, right? Like you can have those guiding principles, but you need to be flexible enough to pivot whenever there is a need to. And I just love the questions coming in, so I'm just going to stick with those.
So you mentioned earlier like this growth mindset.
Yeah.
There's a question here about that. So like I think there's like the term growth mindset in what we're talking about here, product growth. I think they're related but different. So like I think at least when I've heard growth mindset cited, it's in the framework of like growth mindset versus fixed mindset, which is when people think that there's like they're focused on inherent properties that are unchangeable versus constantly changing and learning. And people who tend to have growth mindset, like thinking like, oh, what can I be doing better? Oh, I didn't do this thing so well, I can do it better next time. Or, oh wow, you have that same generosity to other people. Oh wow, like they're doing better today than they did yesterday, and they took my feedback and did something about it. That's so great. And celebrating growth, like that is really key for pretty much anything these days. Like you're not like companies that have large numbers of people who think like that are going to perform better because they're much more mentally pliant, and they're going to be more willing to take on more challenges because they think they can rise to the occasion and do it and work bigger. That's important, and it's an enabler of growth, but it's not necessarily like one and the same. But when it comes to like having a growth product mindset, I think as a startup, you need to think about like, how am I going to grow? Like, I mean, at every startup I've worked at, and I've come in at the ground floor and grown them, many, many multiples in size. Like, it's really key to see like where's your first customer going to come from? Where's your 10th customer going to come from? Where's your 100th customer going to come from? And like of what size? Like, and if we're trying to triple, double revenue, which is like the unicorn IPO path. Where is it going to be? $100,000 to $10,000 a year customers? Is it going to be like $10 million a year customers? Like, how are you going to get to those numbers, right? And that gives you a good sense of like how you need to segment, how you need to approach the market, and then also what kind of growth tactics you need to apply in the product to acquire them. So maybe like you have like $10 million customers, and then you have like 100,000 or like 1,000 $100 customers, and maybe that's where you deploy like a freemium model. Which I think another question here was getting at with sales there, right? Like what a lot of folks do when they have products with like long lead times is these days they're opening up their products to become much more freemium. They're saying, okay, like how can we break out of the enterprise sales model where you have like sales folks who are either calling or interacting with people via email and Zoom calls and whatever, and have the product that's selling itself, right? Like let the person come in, see how it's used, try it out, experience enough value that they then bring in the other people that they need. They start inviting each other to the product. They start using it. And then sooner or later, someone's dropping their credit card in there, and now you have a paying customer.
And I love the term like growth mindset. There's a book, and it's like a highly recommended book for product managers. It's called 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. So I love the concept that he explains in that book. It's like if you're recreating or if you're kind of thinking the same lines as other companies, you'll be stuck at that like 0 level, or really kind of go up maybe like 0.5, 0.7. But to really get to that 0 to 1 on like a good graph, you have to kind of go out of your comfort zone and go out of like uncharted territory and try to create something. And that, to a level, kind of induces risk taking. And that's probably another approach to thinking of like growth metrics, how to grow, is like, where are people? Are there people in this space today? Where are they not? And then can we go and tackle that? So I think that question hits upon like risk taking as well as a step forward from growth mindset. And I think we covered all the questions. I'm also checking time.
Did you have anything to add on that one? The last question here says, would your thoughts change around
Yeah.
product-led growth if your sales and refresh cycles are longer than 18 to 24 months?
Yeah, I agree with you, and would add that I would want as much as possible, like even before formally signing the contract, for instance, as much value and momentum as you can help your product accrue in the months that of the sales cycle or whatever consideration cycle, that's going to be awesome. Like if it feels like, okay, we already, for instance, have been gathering data for you, or just like, I would say if you can focus on that as opposed to maybe, maybe that's my recommendation.
Actually, just reminded me of something else. It's just like, you have to be really mindful of who you're selling to, depending on what tactics you're deploying. So, like for instance, I used to work on one of the startups I worked on was called Localytics, is mobile app analytics and marketing, and while our primary users of the product, let's just say we sold an enterprise contract, the primary users were usually people in product and marketing, mostly marketing, actually, growth marketing. And however, the people integrating the product who would often find the product were engineers, because someone was like, how do we measure this? So we'll always hit the engineers, and the engineers would be like, let's go find an analytics product. And then they would go search around. We'd come up in search results or on Capterra or something, and then they would find their way into the product. So once we realized that engineers were all of our like organic signups, we spent all of our effort on optimizing the onboarding process, the self-service onboarding process for the engineering experience. So it was like real-time, like it was like, okay, your analytics product's all about sending events, right? Yeah. So it's like real-time events viewing as you write code, you can literally see it showing up in the browser live. Like it's very similar to what engineers expect. It was an inline documentation, so you can like literally like copy-paste code snippets for the language you're working within right into your code. At one point, we're considering like auto-integrating using like plugins for the developer environment, where you just press a button and it just like basically integrates itself, which is what Twitter did with its Fabric product back in the day. So we were super highly focused on the developer experience, and it paid dividends. We brought in a lot of these companies, especially when they were small, created a meaningful growth segment, and then some of them became like these mega companies, mega enterprise deals later. So it was then a channel of leads.
That's so cool. I'm just trying to see. So I love asking everyone a question of like, if you could sum it all up, if you could give the audience like one tip or trick from each of you on how to build and maintaining growth within your teams, what would it be? It's kind of the reverse of an elevator pitch.
Do you have one to start with? I'm thinking on this. Sorry if that's unfair, but.
What was the question? Build and maintain, tips on building and maintaining growth.
One tip or trick or one takeaway that you would want the audience to leave with today.
I mean, like I just come back to that like that basic thing. It's like make sure you're aligned internally on like what drives growth. Like can't emphasize that enough. Like if you're not in agreement, especially with the leadership of your group or your department or your company, it's unlikely that you're going to be successful when you hit a roadblock. That you'll get the resources you need. And so if you are in agreement on that, that's the coin of the realm. That's what opens the door for you to get the resources, continues sustaining that growth. So it's not just like a step function thing that peters out, but that it continues growing exponentially. Like your org needs to grow in order to sustain that as much as your tactics need to be aligned with that kind of growth.
Cool. Something I might say is, as much as possible, try to think out all of the possible scenarios before you launch an experiment or a new project. and think about what course of action your company should take based on each of those scenarios. I was thinking of this when, Matt, you mentioned sometimes you'll ship something and one metric goes way up and one goes moderately up and then one goes down, and then you're like, oh shoot, what do I do now? Or for instance, if your company's set on one path and you think conversations are really important and it's been a month or two and you're not seeing the results, like is that time to pivot, or is that time to, like, you just need more time to see the fruits of your efforts? I think the more you can kind of codify in advance, here's the range of options we're expecting to see, and then here's how we'll react to each. I think that adds a lot of clarity in often very ambiguous results. And I think it also pushes you as a growth team and you as a company to really think about the underlying mechanics and kind of continuously make your mental model of what's happening at the company level. I think it forces you to make that mental model a lot sharper with each iteration.
Thank you. And then since you asked me the question,
Yeah.
my takeaway would be definitely I would go back to that risk taking. I think there's a lot of value in looking for new opportunities while building upon the opportunity that you have at hand. I think one person yesterday, he mentioned, mining for gold and then also going out and digging for new gold. I also think that's a really important feature to have. But yeah, thank you so much. A great discussion. I hope all of you enjoyed it. And
thanks for the great questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions. Yeah.